Hey everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about my development preferences. So I've already talked about what elements of a game make it an RPG for me. And I've also talked about what I think makes a good game. In other words, the metrics you can measure a game by for you to decide whether it's a good game. You can go watch those videos. This one is more about what I consider to be my own preferences in one of the games I'm making. Part of the reason I'm doing this is I've had people ask questions where they seem to be assuming that I want something in a game that isn't necessarily what I want. One of them was, well, don't you like complicated system mechanics? And I'm like, I've made a lot of games with complicated system mechanics, and I've made games with simpler mechanics. I don't necessarily have a preference, but I know a lot of people do. So what I'm going to talk here, you can view this talk as what makes a Tim Cain game. I'm going to talk about those things I prefer. If someone said to me tomorrow, make a game, this is the immediate way I start leaning whenever I make a game. So first of all, I like making RPGs. Duh. That's pretty obvious from the games I've made. I've made non-RPGs, but I like playing tabletop RPGs. It's what I grew up doing. I like role-playing games, and I like making them. For any one of my games, though, you'll know that I'm also really big into reactivity, and specifically player agency, player choice, and consequence for those choices. I want the player to be able to do what they want, and then I want the game to have consequences for that. This is why I got upset once when someone said, I can't believe your game let me kill a child. I'm like, my game didn't make you do it. It just allows it. And the fact that you know it's possible means you're a bad person. And there's really bad consequences for doing it. I never really want to restrict player agency because someone says, well, that's a bad thing to do. Of course it's a bad thing to do. And the game tells you it's a bad thing to do. And after you do it, bad things happen to your player character. I don't want to restrict choice because then I have to start restricting consequence. And then that induces a morality. It imposes a morality on the player, which is getting my next point, which is I love gray morality games. I like games that don't necessarily say you're going to be a good person or you're the background, you're the sheriff of this town and you have to uphold the law. I don't want to make a game like that because I don't want to play a game like that. I prefer to let the player choose whether he wants to be good or evil and then live with that. Now I've had to, make allowances when I'm making IPs that aren't mine. So when I made my D&D game, alignment was something that was built into the system. Yeah, I could have yanked it out, but it's kind of baked into D&D. At least it was at that point. It felt like an odd thing to pull out. For the same reason, I don't want to make a real-time D&D game. I felt like the whole game was designed to be turn-based. Leave it alone. Which gets me into my next preference. Given my choices, given my druthers, I would rather make an original IP than make a game in someone else's IP. Now, I've broken that rule a number of times. I made Bard's Tale Construction Set. I made Temple of Elemental Evil. I made a South Park game. But I can say that if I had a choice, I would have rather have made an original IP because, first of all, I've got so many ideas that why would I spend time implementing someone else's? D&D meant something to me, and Vampire was already started up by my coworkers, so I worked on that. But if it's my own personal choice, I want to work on an original IP, my own original IP. That said, I had a ton of fun working on Pillars of Eternity, which was Josh's original IP, and Tyranny, which Chris Avallone started. And I really like exploring an original IP when the IP creator is right there. So I can ask them questions and go, okay, if I understand it, this will happen and these will be consequences. So I like that. So I guess what I'm saying is if I'm not the original IP creator, I prefer for them to be sitting right next to me and it to be a real-time creation that we're involved in. This kind of goes into my preference for not making sequels. I've never been one for making sequels, even when Fallout shipped, even before Fallout shipped. I was telling my bosses, I don't really want to work on Fallout 2. I know a lot of you are like, oh, how could you not want to do that? Fallout was great. A lot of you knew it was great. I just wanted to work on something else. I'd worked on Fallout for 3.5 years. I had other ideas. I had ideas that didn't fit into Fallout. People on the team had ideas that didn't fit into Fallout. I think after you spend a number of years in something, you've kind of earned the right to work on something else. Now, I admire people who make one game IP for a decade or two of their career. That's hardcore. It's not me. I would rather make a new game than keep working on sequels of a particular game I've made. Similarly, I prefer to make a game that has humor in it. I've tried to add humor into every game I've ever done. There's some of my games are a little less humorous than others. But I like putting humor in a game because I think overall games should be fun. I've stated multiple times I prefer fun over balance. Now, and I've said, don't forget that I said an imbalanced game isn't fun. If it's way imbalanced, it's not fun. But I think it's okay for some character classes or some player builds to be more powerful or less powerful than others. That's part of the challenge. It's fun. Similar or related to that, I think on games I make, I want the player to make his own character. I hate handing a character to a player. When I have to, I try to make that character as generic as possible. So for Fallout, when you get voted out of the vault, the reason I wanted that voting out is because that lets anybody get kicked out of the vault. You know, if you make a super dumb character, you may go, you know, why would that be the person they send out to save them? No, they voted him out. They just wanted him out of the vault. They'd wait 2 weeks and then send someone else out. When you played Outer Worlds and you were a frozen colonist, in the opening cinematic, it shows Phineas going through different people, and he was rushed. The ship started getting attacked, so he just grabbed someone and ran. That's what I loved about it. That left the background of that character up to the player. Which gets me into settings. So remember I told you I always go setting, story, system mechanics. So let's talk about the three of those and what my preferences are. Just like I like making original IP and I don't like making sequels, I like making different settings. I don't want to stay in one setting too long. It kind of wears out its welcome to me. So every time I've made a new game, I've tried to change the setting. And I always want to have a twist in there. It doesn't have to be an M. Night Shyamalan twist, but I like my twists. So Fallout was post-apoc. You know, like Wasteland was, like other games had been. But our twist was it was retrofuturism. It was the future that the 1950s thought would happen. That had a cool twist. Arcanum. Yeah, it was a standard fantasy, very Lord of the Rings-esque fantasy game. But it was undergoing an industrial age. All kinds of scenarios pop out in my head about that. Quests and characters and stories. The game I was making at Carbine for WildStar, it was science fiction with spellcasters. That was very different than Arcanum. Arcanum wasn't science fiction. Arcanum was fantasy, getting into an industrial age. WildStar was pretty strongly science fiction. Oh, but there were spellcasters. Magic worked. And then with Outer Worlds, we said, okay, we're going to do a pure science fiction, hard science fiction, but let's make it dystopian. Let's make it colonies that corporations have set up. In fact, I often talked on the team that this was a pre-apocalyptic setting. That if we could jump forward 100 or 200 years, there's probably going to be something apocalyptic happening. If not on the colonies, then widespread Earth and the colonies. Which gets me to stories. I prefer stories that are nonlinear, of course. The games I make, I like to say that because I want player agency, I want the player to be able to choose the path they take on the story. So the story has to be able to adapt to that, which gets me to the second thing I like about my stories is that they're player driven. When my narrative designer's like, I have this story and it'll be like, it'll hit beats A, B, and C. I'm like, I always get concerned right there and go, wait a minute. What if the player doesn't do B? What if the player doesn't even go to the location that has B? So that gets back to nonlinearity, but also it means that that nonlinearity is driven by the player. It's not driven by an external agency. I want the story to react to the player, not force the player to react to the story. And I think that's an important distinction. And then finally, when I made the mechanics, I always wanted something unique in them. I never wanted to ship a game where somebody said, I've seen all that before. So for Fallout, we had a lot of new stuff in that. I mean, I think Fallout was the first CRPG to use anything like perks. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but having a huge number of fairly disconnected bonuses that you could just pick from in a pool when you went up level, I don't think any computer game had done that. And the dumb dialogue, I don't recall seeing in any game before Fallout. And I've seen them in other games since. So I knew we were onto something. Similarly, Arcanum had fate points, which were the things you got for doing major quests, these points that you could then spend to force die rolls to be a certain way. You could force a critical, you could force a full heal, you could force an enemy to critically fail. I like stuff like that. I like that sense of the player's got this incredible power. He can't use it too many times, but he's got it there waiting to use. Similarly, the whole magic tech balance in Arcanum I thought was a really interesting feature that wasn't just talked about in the story. And, you had characters talking about, oh God, the elves are getting upset at the rise of tech. The, tech people are like, okay, elves, it's not your time anymore. And the dwarves are gone, so it's human time. I like that. But it was reflected directly in your player character with that magic tech meter that would go up and down. And you couldn't be full magic and full tech. It was like a continuum. On Temple of Elemental Evil, I was a little more restricted on what new ideas I could bring to it because it was D&D and I didn't want to make it not D&D. However, I did introduce the idea of party alignment, which was, well, if you're forced to pick alignment for characters, party alignment was what restricted your party from having too many disparate characters. It's like I couldn't understand why a paladin and an assassin would be in the same party. So I came up with the idea of party alignment where you picked a party alignment and everyone's alignment had to be one step from that. And then from there, that jumping off point, that gave us the opening vignettes, which were based on party alignment. Wish we had time to do more with those vignettes. I really wanted them to be a couple hours each, but I thought that was an interesting addition to D&D. In WildStar, we had the whole path system, which wasn't the class. The class was the game telling you how you could play. Paths were you telling the game how you like to play, which was things like I like exploring, I like killing, I like classifying and everything I run into, I like socializing. Those were paths. They were right out of Richard Bartle's book on MMOs, but I'd never seen that put in a computer game before. And lastly, with Outer Worlds, I had been thinking ever since Fallout for 2 decades, I've been trying to figure out how to put disadvantages, which I saw in GURPS and really liked, into a computer game. Why would people pick them? In GURPS, it was you got points back at character creation, but I wanted it to have more reactivity with the world. And since Fallout, achievements had started becoming bigger and bigger in computer games, and achievements require the computer game to track everything the player's doing. And I thought flaws were an interesting way of reflecting back to the player, hey, I saw what you did there, or I saw what happened. So that if you get, if you're constantly taking lots of damage or being critically hit by robots, it makes sense to go, you want to be robophobic? Do you want to be scared of robots? You have a lot of good reasons to be scared. And I like that. And I'm hoping that's something that will be a jumping off point. I hope I see that in other games or similar kind of mechanics, ideas behind things you can make a game more reactive to what the player's doing. I hope I see that in other games because I want to play that. So I think that's a big chunk of my development preferences. And I think if you put all of those together, that's what I think a Tim Cain game is. And notice there's a whole bunch of things I didn't say because I don't think they're as important. I don't necessarily need complicated system mechanics. I don't need 80-hour games. I don't need a game that ends when the story's over. I'm fine with an open-ended game, but as long as the consequences are there for the player. So there's a lot of things I've heard people say, oh, I bet Tim liked this. No, some people are right, some aren't. Oddly, people seem to have no idea of how right or wrong they are. They're just very confident that's what I want. But I think everything I listed here will give you a good idea of what I think a Tim Cain game is. Not that you asked directly, but I think this answers a lot of questions I've seen in my YouTube comments. So I hope I answered one of your questions if you're watching this.